Am I ready to do a video about the transcendental deduction? No. Am I gonna do it? Yes. Welcome back. In the previous video, I talked about the metaphysical deduction, but I'm just gonna, again, give you a map of where we are at the moment. So the critique of pure reason is divided into the transcendental doctrine of elements and the transcendental doctrine of method. At the moment, we haven't touched the methods yet. We're just in the transcendental doctrine of elements. The transcendental doctrine of elements, it itself divided into the transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental logic. A couple of weeks ago, I did a video about the transcendental aesthetic, which is everything about space and time, how we see everything in space and time. A couple of weeks ago, I also started a video on the transcendental logic. The transcendental logic is much longer, and it's itself divided into transcendental analytic and transcendental dialectic. Transcendental analytic is about how we get the categories and how we prove the categories are a priori, and all the ways into which we see objects of experience through categories. And the transcendental dialectic is the mistakes that we make when we apply bad sense objects of experience. We're still in the transcendental analytic, and last video was about the first part of the analytic of concepts. Transcendental analytic divided into analytic of concepts and analytic of principles. The analytic of concepts just deals with purely where we get the categories and how do we prove that they are a priori. We're still there, and we're going to finish the analytic of concepts today. Last video was about the first part, which is the metaphysical deduction. This video is going to be about the transcendental deduction, how we prove the categories are a priori. And it's going to be very extensive. And then hopefully the next video we'll talk about the analytic of principles, which is Kant's famous schematism, the axioms, the analogies of pure reason, the anticipations and the postulates. But that will be next video. Cool. Okay, we are settled. Let's start easy. What is the aim of the transcendental deduction? Why do we have such an extensive chapter, or such an extensive 50, I don't know how many pages is it, but it's very intense part of the critique of pure reason? What is this for? What is Kant trying to get to? Kant, with the transcendental deduction, is trying to look for a special argument, different from the kind of argument that we saw in the transcendental aesthetic with space and time. So what Kant's going to try to do is to show that the categories are legitimately applied to objects because they are a priori structures that come before experience and is what allows us to get any experience, get to know any experience at all. And as I said in the previous video, Kant had a dilemma, and his dilemma was that on one side we've got sensibility, which is the experience of objects, how we see objects, intuition, which is run by the faculty of sensibility. On the other hand, we've got the understanding, which is concepts that may arise from that object, but they don't directly originate from the object. We create it ourselves in our understanding. For example, I could have an intuition of this cup, okay, and I see it, it occupies a space, it has some extension. I also know, apart from the existence of the cup, that it is my favorite cup, or that it's a beautiful cup, or the fact that I bought it in a market 3 years ago. All of those things, I cannot see that in the cup directly. There are general things that I know about the cup that originated in my understanding, not in the cup itself. Do we understand? Yeah, cool. Okay, so on one hand we have sensibility, how we see things, and on the other hand we've got the understanding, so concepts, things that are not directly in the object. Kant had this dilemma about how we build a bridge between sensibility and understanding. How do we put those two together? They seem to work perfectly. When I see an object, when I see the cup, it always matches with my concepts about the origin of the cup or about the cup in general. How is it always the same? How is it possible that my sensibility and my understanding always match each other and work perfectly? What kind of mechanism makes them so they together create a conceptual thought? At the end of the day, they're very different. One of them, they use completely different faculties. And this question is going to permeate. This question is going to be in the transcendental deduction all the time and at many different other parts of the critique of pure reason. Right, so we've got that clear. We're trying to prove that categories are legitimately applied to objects. That's our objective. Before we get into any text, I want to point out that for Kant, there are two questions that we need to ask about an object. The first question is quid facti, the question of whether we possess an object or not. Okay, do we actually have a category? Do we actually have a judgment? Does that actually exist? Do we have an existence of it? And that question, quid facti, is what we proved in the last video, in the metaphysical deduction. The categories actually exist, judgments exist, and the categories are derived from judgments. But now, there is a very different question about, does the actual concept exist, from the question of, are they legitimately existing? Like, are they legitimately applied to objects? That is a different thing, right? The concept of my cup has quid facti, for example, because it exists, but it also has quid juris. I have legitimately reasons to justify the existence of the cup. It actually applies to something in real life, right? It's an object in real life. The concept of my cup has a epistemic legitimacy, if you want to call it that way. And that is what Kant's trying to do on the transcendental deduction. But for example, a unicorn, it has quid facti because we have a concept of a unicorn. You can see, all the cultural references to unicorns and in myths and in stories, popular stories. But that doesn't mean that it has a quid juris, because it cannot be legitimately applied to anything as an object. They don't exist. Sorry to break it to you. So in this video, we're going to focus on that last question, quid juris. Are the categories, the existence of the categories, is that legitimately applied? Do they have a reason to exist? We're going to see how Kant does this and tries to prove the categories have quid juris. I'm going to give you a summary of the two main interpretations that we get when we read the Transcendental Deduction. So at least we have two clearest kind of aims in the Transcendental Deduction. The first one is the legitimacy thesis, which establishes that the categories are legitimately applied to objects of experience, and the way these concepts, these categories, are applied to these objects of experience yield a synthetic a priori knowledge of empirical reality. So it explains the origin of the synthetic a priori, because how do I know that 2 plus 2 is 4. How do I know that if I touch really, really hot water, I'm going to burn my finger, which is what happened this morning? I know it because the categories are already applied to objects when I see them, and they are a priori structures. Therefore, when that happens, I get to know myself, oh yeah, if I put my finger in boiling water, I'm going to burn myself. That is synthetic a priori. Why synthetic? Because I only get to know that I burn myself when I do it. I don't know that when I'm born, and kids learn to do that by getting into little accidents. But Kant says that that is a priori, because the category of causality was already in our understanding. And when that happens, the first time we put into practice that causality principle, we get an understanding of it and we get knowledge of it. That is why it's synthetic a priori. And with this legitimacy thesis, Kant is trying to answer what Hume said. So for Hume, there's no causality, there's only events that happen one after the other, succession of events. And there is no reason why there should be a causality principle. We cannot see causality. Kant is answering to Hume by saying, well, causality is a category that exists inside us a priori, and it applies to objects of experience whenever we experience them. What makes causality synthetic a priori, even though this, at least we don't know that this applies to the noumena, to things in themselves. That is the legitimacy thesis. Then we've got the restriction thesis, which is that the categories cannot yield any knowledge about the things in themselves. It only works in unappearances. So synthetic a priori judgments are possible because the categories are part of what makes experience of objects possible, and they only have validity as human appearances and cannot go beyond experience. Cool, so those are the two clear-ish aims that we have about the Transcendental Deduction, what Kant concludes. Right, so how is Kant going to prove this? What is his argument to prove that the categories are legitimately applied to objects of experience? Well, it's not very clear. I'm just going to stick to a very general interpretation of it. There's many people that have written about this, loads and loads, and books and so many papers about what Kant may have intended with this argument, and what the argument, how the argument could be structured. So I'm going to give you a brief now so you get a general idea of what this may look like. The starting point for the Transcendental Deduction seems to be that experience requires some sort of connection or combination. Experience does not only require intuition, me seeing things, experiencing things, perceiving things, it also requires a combination, a synthesis of different acts. I need some unity, some synthesis of, as we will see, our perceptions in order for me to understand, to take in anything that I see. So it's not only that I see the cup and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a cup, amazing. My brain somehow has to go through a synthesis that combines all of the properties of the cup, and I kind of like make a union of it. And that is a process that is done by the understanding. We will talk about synthesis more in the A deduction and the B deduction, because the transcendental deduction, this is general argument, but there's two different versions of it. We're going to have a look at the A deduction, which is the first version, much more obscure, not that well renowned, but we're going to have a look at it. And then we have the B deduction, which is the second version, the corrected version that Kant wrote. And we will also have a look at that one and compare both, what things we get from the A deduction, what things we get from the B deduction. Anyway, so in order for me to comprehend anything, I need that synthesis. And that synthesis requires judgment. It requires the faculty of understanding. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to synthesize anything. That's something that the understanding does. The faculty of understanding is also the faculty of judgment. I cannot do anything, I cannot comprehend anything without judgment, which is what we saw on the last video. And judgments are very closely related to categories. So this is where Kant is trying to go. He's trying to say, well, in order to comprehend anything, I need to not only intuit it, I also need to have some kind of synthesis. And that synthesis is done by the understanding. That understanding works with judgments and categories. So in order to experience anything, we need the categories. So very briefly, intuition requires synthesis. Synthesis requires understanding requires categories, very briefly. Now, the argument is deeply contested, as I said, and there's actually two different readings that many academics have done on transcendental deduction, and that is a progressive reading and a regressive reading. The academics that defend the progressive reading say that what Kant is trying to argue is that the mere fact that we are thinking about something, that we are conscious about what we see, that we have a unity of our perception, implies the existence of an objective, lawful world, which is ruled by the categories. Even the Cartesian skeptics that deny the existence of the empirical world and deny everything that is empirical would not be able to refute this, because they would not be able to deny that there is an objective world, because they cannot deny that we have a consciousness, and the I think implies that there's one person that thinks about something, and that is the unity of our perception. Without it, we would not be able to think about anything, and we would not be able to make any kind of synthesis. And the fact that we are conscious implies the existence of an objective world from which to get some knowledge. This progressive interpretation is a much more traditional way of interpreting Kant. From that fact, Kant deduces that there must be some conditions that make such unified experience possible, and that has to be the categories. Therefore, the existence of one consciousness, the existence of one subject who can have that unified experience, already guarantees an objective, law-like structure to experience. So this progressive reading is based on consciousness, of the unity of our perception, and that implies an objective world where these rules apply. But then we have a regressive interpretation, and this regressive interpretation is much more limited. People that defend this interpretation say that Kant argues that the categories be true of all objects of experience. Why is this interpretation a little bit weaker? Because if we say that empirical knowledge requires that the categories be true of all possible objects of experience, we are already starting from the point that we have objective knowledge and we have empirical knowledge. We start from there, whereas in the progressive one we start from consciousness, the fact that we only have one consciousness, one I think, that unifies everything. In this case, we already have the start point of empirical knowledge, and that is much easier to refute. The Cartesian skeptics could say, well, I just refute your first premise, there's no empirical knowledge. So this interpretation explains the existence of categories and their legitimate use if we agree that there is empirical knowledge. But that is assumed. It doesn't itself establish the external world to the skeptic. What would be this empirical knowledge for Kant? Well, Kant is not talking about a very broad statement about, we have empirical knowledge of these things and these things and this. It's much more rudimentary than what we may think. It's simply that we know that some events are objectively successive. One thing happens after the other, and that is not merely subjective. Also, we know that some events happen simultaneously, and then for that reason that we have that objective idea of succession would make the categories necessary conditions of possibility of knowledge. Things like the cup is here and now there. The cup is up and then the cup is down in this position and then in that position. That is the kind of like empirical knowledge that Kant is talking about. Those are the two interpretations, progressive and regressive. The first interpretation, progressive, could refute the radical skeptic who denies that we have knowledge of an external world, but does not presumably deny that we are conscious subjects. And then the second interpretation, the regressive, would be much more problematic because he would not be able to refute a skeptic. And I think these two readings are interesting. However, I don't think Kant was trying to refute skeptics in any way. So I don't think the fact that the second one does not have the intention of refuting skeptics makes it less valid. I mean, it makes it weaker in some sense, but I don't think Kant was trying to refute the skeptics. It was not his main objective. But those are the two interpretations. And also, I'm going to give you an example of why the category of causality would be objective. As we saw last week, causality takes its origin from a judgment. The category of causality is derived from the judgment of the hypothetical, which was, if this happened, something else happened. So if, then kind of judgment. From there, the category of causality is derived. So if I take the causal claim of me drinking coffee causes me feeling happier and more energized, that is basically taken from the hypothetical judgment of if I take coffee, I would feel more energized or happier. So conditional judgments or hypothetical judgments of the form of if A then B expresses an asymmetric necessitation of relation between A and B. And that relation between objects is what we consider to be a causal relation. Okay, so that was a little bit of an introduction in order for us to put ourselves in context to understand the transcendental deduction. So what is the basic argument? Okay, if in order to put together this argument, I've read Gaia's book, A Companion to the Critique of Pure Reason by Cambridge University Press, and other papers that I will put in the description. Right, so what's the basic argument? So the first premise would be experience requires the synthesis of intuitions. So what we see, sounds, what we smell, doesn't by itself form a coherent experience unless I apply or I am involved in some kind of synthesis. All of those bits are put together by my understanding and I synthesize it. I join it up into a single presentation, which is the cup, the lamp, the phone, a scene, an event. Premise number 2 is that the synthesis of intuitions requires that the forms of judgments be applied to them. So in order to unify something into something that we're able to think about, we use the logical forms of judgment that's also done by the understanding. Judgments that organize everything that we perceive. I could say, that cup is brown. Okay, I'm making a judgment of affirmation. And premise 3 is that the forms of judgment applied to intuitions are the categories, because the categories are derived from judgments. So from the very, very first time we see something, we experience something, the categories are already involved in it. Premise 4, which is the conclusion, thus experience requires the categories. If you have any experience at all, you need the categories. The categories were the necessary conditions for that experience. If you're happy or dissatisfied about this argument, I am sorry, because Kant does not provide much else on this. This is as much as you can get from what Kant is saying, but that doesn't mean that what Kant says is not interesting. It's very interesting. So that's why we're going to do a close reading of the passages. As I said, we're going to do the A deduction first and then the B deduction. We're going to apply everything that we said into Kant's quotes. We're going to start the close reading. Whoa! Right, A deduction first, then B deduction afterwards. There's 2 paragraphs that are common. So paragraph 13 and paragraph 14 is the introduction to the transcendental deduction, and then we'll move on to the A deduction. Right, paragraph 13. Kant starts with a metaphor, and I'm going to read it because it's quite interesting. When Kant uses metaphors, I cheer. They're not like very poetical, but at least he's trying. Right, so he says at B116, B117, jurists, when speaking of rights and claim, distinguish in a legal action the question of right, quid juris, from the question of fact, quid facti, and they demand that both be proved. Proof of the former, which has to state the right or the legal claim, they entitle the deduction. Many empirical concepts are employed without question from anyone. Since experience is always available for the proof of the objective reality, we believe ourselves, even without a deduction, to be justified in appropriating to them a meaning and ascribe significance. But there are also usurpatory concepts such as fortunate fate, which, though allowed to circulate by almost universal indulgence, are yet from time to time challenged by the question, quid juris. This demand for a deduction involves us in considerable perplexity, no clear legal title sufficient to justify their employment being obtainable either from experience or from reason. So what Kant is saying is that lawyers separate the fact, what actually happened, from right, what legal rule applies, and then both must be proven in court. Kant is saying, Like a lawyer who must prove both the facts and the legal right, we must deduce and give a justification for certain concepts when their claim to apply isn't established by experience alone. So some empirical concepts need no proof, but other concepts which people use freely, like fortune, justice, whatever, require a transcendental title, which is a deduction, to show they legitimately apply to experience, which is a quid juris. The proof of the right, the justification for applying a concept, is what Kant calls a deduction. Lots of everyday concepts are backed up directly by experience, so people accept them without needing a separate philosophical justification. But other concepts, as I said, fate, fortune, which is the words that Kant uses, are used casually, but lack a clear basis. Someone can challenge them and demand a justification of those words. What is your legal title for using this concept? They may ask. And when that lawyer is challenged, it's very hard to find a legitimate source, either empirical evidence or pure reason, in order to justify its application. That's why Kant thinks a transcendental deduction is necessary to show which concepts legitimately apply to objects of experience. So why do we need a transcendental deduction? Because some concepts, like the categories, are used to judge experience, but they don't actually come from experience. They are a priori. So we must show they are legitimately applicable. So Kant, from the very beginning, is framing the transcendental deduction with a legal style challenge, which is the question on what grounds do you apply these concepts to objects? And we imagine ourselves in a court right now, thinking about how the hell we are going to give a justification of the application of the categories to objects. And similarly to a court case as well, we have empirical evidence, physical evidence, and then we have other types of evidence, which is things that we cannot really prove with the senses. Similarly, Kant establishes two kinds of deduction, empirical and transcendental. Okay, so empirical is how concepts arise from experience, and transcendental is why pure a priori concepts legitimately apply to objects. So at B117, he says, the explanation of the manner in which concepts can thus relate a priori to objects I entitle the transcendental deduction, and from it I distinguish empirical deduction, which shows the manner in which a concept is acquired through experience and through reflection upon experience, and which therefore concerns not its legitimacy, but only its de facto mode of origination. So we have those two projects. Empirical deduction explains how a concept arises from experience, psychological empirical origin, and that is not enough for the categories. We need legitimacy. And as I explained, this is a new challenge for Kant, because when we were doing the transcendental aesthetic, space and time are a priori forms of sensibility, and they were already deduced as conditions for appearances, and that is what allows us to experience anything. But categories are different because they are pure concepts of the understanding, but unlike space and time, they are not intuitions, and they raise that harder problem. We cannot see causality. It is not empirical. How can the categories then be proved to apply to any object that could be given to us? At least space and time is some kind of intuition. We see things in space. We clearly see that space exists. We clearly see or sense that time exists, but that's not the case with the categories. And this is what Kant explains at B122, B123. The categories of the understanding, on the contrary, do not represent to us conditions under which objects are given intuition at all. Hence, objects can indeed appear to us without necessarily having to be related to functions of the understanding, and therefore without the understanding containing the a priori conditions. For the objects of sensible intuition must accord with the formal conditions of sensibility that lie in man a priori, is clear from the fact that otherwise they would not be object for us, but that they must also accord with the condition that the understanding requires for the synthetic unity of thinking is a conclusion that is not so easily seen. But I do see a problem with this passage, because if Kant says that, as we have said in the beginning, that the categories are conditions of the possibility of experience, how can he here say that the objects can indeed appear to us without the categories, and that the categories are not conditions under which objects are given in intuition at all? Is not Kant contradicting himself? How can we see things without the categories? That would not make sense. The categories are supposed to allow us to have any experience at all. And in this particular passage, we need to understand the confusion that is raised when we handle the concepts of experience and cognition, because they are different. So what is the confusion about the terms experience and cognition? As I said, Kant's goal is to establish that the categories are a priori conditions of the possibility of experience. You're going to hear me say this 50 times, 100 times, memorize it. It's not very clear what he means by experience. Experience could be sense, perception, consciousness. At B161, later on, he says, all syntheses through which even perception itself becomes possible stands under the categories. So this sounds like some kind of conceptualism about perceptual content, but experience could also be referred as empirical knowledge. This is what Kant says at 147. Empirical cognition is called experience. Kant also insists that objects can be given to sense without the categories applying to them. And this kind of contradictions is what made many academics tear their hair out. People think that he may be contradicting himself, other people think that maybe he failed at expressing himself correctly. I don't know what it could have been. Feels like later on in the Transcendental Deduction, Kant establishes and states multiple times, affirms that we cannot experience anything without the categories. So I assume that he just made a little mistake there. If you know more, please let me know. In paragraph 13, Kant also proposes another challenge, which is a very interesting problem. If we're going to prove the objective validity of the categories, and the categories are subjective because they don't apply to things in themselves, how can subjective functions of thought, the categories, can apply or have objective validity and can be legitimately applied to objects if they are subjective? Empirical deduction cannot secure any strict necessary concepts like causality. They must be a priori or inside us, otherwise they will be abandoned or empty. They will not be a priori. But then if they are inside of us, wouldn't that be a subjective function of humans? How are they going to have objective validity? This is where Kant says that it has objective validity for objects of experience as human appearances and not in things in themselves. And then we do a transcendental deduction, and then a transcendental deduction is required to show that the categories are conditions for the possibility of experience. At B124, he says, it must either be grounded completely a priori in the understanding or must be entirely given up as a mere phantom of the brain, the categories being a priori or a posteriori. For this concept to make strict demand that something A should be such that something else B follows from it necessarily and in accordance with an absolutely universal rule. Appearances do indeed present cases from which a rule can be obtained according to which something usually happens, but they never prove the sequence to be necessary. To the synthesis of cause and effect there belongs a dignity which cannot be empirically expressed, namely that the effect not only succeeds upon the cause, but that it is posited through it and arises out of it. This strict universality of the rule is never a characteristic of empirical rules. They can acquire through induction only comparative universality, that is, extensive applicability. We move on to paragraph 14. So this is like a transition section to the Transcendental Deduction, and here he's basically saying that pure concepts, the categories, are a priori conditions for the very possibility of experience. And there are two ways of presenting this, and there are two ways a representation can relate to an object. This is B125. Either the object alone must take the representation possible, or the representation alone must take the object possible. In the former case, this relation is only empirical, and the representation is never possible a priori. So either the world causes your mental representation, empirical explanation, or your representation is what makes something count as an object for you, which is a transcendental explanation. Kant needs the second option, the transcendental explanation, to secure how our concepts can legitimately apply to objective experience. On the same bookmark, B125, he establishes two conditions that we need in order to get any knowledge, which is intuition and concepts. He says, now there are two conditions under which alone the knowledge of an object is possible. First, intuition, through which it is given, though only as an appearance. Secondly, concept, through which an object is thought corresponding to this intuition. So, to know anything you need something given to you, which is intuition, the sensation shaped by space and time, and B, a concept to think it. Both are required to get knowledge. Then we come back to the central problem to B122, where he says how subjective conditioned thought can have objective validity. Again, that problem of how the categories can have objective validity if they're subjective. And Kant answers this at B126, where he says the objective validity of the categories as a priori concepts rests, therefore, on the fact that so far as the form of thought is concerned, through them alone does experience become possible. Not really explaining himself a lot here. but he's reiterating, yeah, it has objective validity no matter what. And then he says they relate of necessity and a priori to objects of experience, for the reason that only by means of them can any object whatsoever of experience be thought. If only by using the categories can we think any object as an object of experience, then they have a legitimate claim to apply to all such objects. Again, he's not explaining himself very much here, that's what's coming next. And then also in paragraph 14, he talks about Locke and Hume and says that empirical derivation, so deriving things just purely empirically, leads to dogmatism, which is Locke, or skepticism, Hume. Kant says, the illustrious Locke, failing to take account of these considerations and meeting with pure concepts of the understanding and experience, deduced them also from experience, and yet proceeded so inconsequently that he attempted with their aid to obtain knowledge which far transcends all limits of experience. David Hume recognized that, in order to be able to do this, it was necessary that these concepts should have an a priori origin, but since he could not explain how it can be possible that the understanding must think concepts, which are not in themselves connected in the understanding, as being necessarily connected in the object, and see, it never occurred to him that the understanding might itself perhaps, through these concepts, be the author of experience in which his objects are found, he was constrained to derive them from experience, namely from a subjective necessity, so from custom and habit, which arises from repeated association in experience and which comes mistakenly to be regarded as objective. What Hume concludes in his explanation of causality, for example, is that we cannot see causality empirically, and we made the association of A causes B purely by habit because it always happens. Every time ball A hits ball B moves. Kant is talking about those answers to this, to this question of how we're going to get laws, universal laws, and how they failed. So Locke tries to get these concepts from experience, and that is too permissive. How we're going to get a priori things, universal laws, a priori laws from experience, that doesn't make sense. And Hume reduces them to just habit and custom, thus leading to skepticism, rejects that necessity. And Kant wants that middle path, secure the a priori status of the categories without losing that link to experience, because he's not an idealist. Then at B128, he establishes the connection between the judgments and the categories, because categories correspond to the logical functions of judgment and determine as well how we treat representations. He says, but first I shall introduce a word of explanation in regard to the categories. They are concepts of an object in general, by means of which the intuition of an object is regarded as determined in respect of one of the logical functions of judgment. Thus, the function of the categorical judgment is that of the relation of subject to predicate. For example, all bodies are divisible. So again, how the categories were derived was because we derived the table of judgments in the previous video, and the categories relate to them, okay? They determine how we must organize the representations. And then at the end of this section, he makes a final point, and he says that the transcendental deduction seeks, so it's looking for the original relation of these concepts to possible experience. He says, the transcendental deduction of all a priori concepts has thus a principle according to which the whole inquiry must be directed, namely that they must be recognized as a priori conditions for the possibility of experience, alike of in the intuition which is to be met with it and of the thought. So the method of this transcendental deduction is going to be to demonstrate that the categories are necessary conditions for any possible experience. That is the legal title, the warrant that Kant promised at the beginning. And in order to do that, we need to deeply think about the relationship between the subject and the object, trying to find what conceptually is presupposed a priori in the grasp of ourselves represented in the objects of cognition. That is a relationship that we need to look at in a lot of detail. And what Kant would say about this is that this very notion of the subject-object relationship will involve the categories being applied a priori in any object that we get from experience. Okay, so that was the introduction. Now, the A deduction. So the A deduction is the first draft of the transcendental deduction argument that Kant wrote. Then it was corrected, it was rewritten into the B deduction. But they are quite different, very different indeed, in presentation and also in arguments. So I'm going to do both. The A deduction was very dense. I didn't get a full grasp of it yet. I tried to read some secondary literature in order to understand many of the concepts. I'm just going to go over the main ideas, which are quite interesting in my opinion. He talks about the imagination, the 3 types of synthesis, even though in a very obscure manner. So the key idea here of this A deduction is that just a representation is nothing to us. It only gains that objectivity status after it's been taken up by unity, by a synthesis. So take that idea, put it in your brain and keep it. So first big idea about the A deduction is that for Kant there are 3 syntheses. Remember that synthesis was that process done by the understanding whereby we synthesize, we put all the bits of intuitions and unite them into one. Only that way we're able to comprehend it, to properly perceive it. Otherwise representation would be nothing to us. So there's 3 syntheses: synthesis of apprehension, synthesis of reproduction and synthesis of recognition. And those are the mind's a priori operations that make experience possible. This is, I believe this is not in the B deduction, so Kant took it out in the second version, but I think it's very interesting to explain it, even though Kant took it out. So these 3 syntheses are not completely separate. They need to happen at the same time in order for us to get a synthesis of something, a unity of something. They have to happen simultaneously and they don't happen in stages. They just come in together all simultaneously. So let's start with the synthesis of apprehension. The synthesis of apprehension happens in intuition, in the faculty of sensibility. And what Kant says, this is A99, A100. He says, every intuition contains in itself a manifold, many representations, which can be represented as a manifold only insofar as the mind distinguishes the time in the sequence of one impression upon another. For each representation, insofar as it is contained in a single moment, can never be anything but absolute unity. In order that unity of intuition may arise out of this manifold, as is required in the representation of space, it must first be wound through and held together. This act I name the synthesis of apprehension because it is directed upon intuition, which does indeed offer a manifold, but a manifold which can never be represented as a manifold and as contained in a single representation, save in virtue of such a synthesis. The synthesis of apprehension must also be exercised a priori, that is, in respect of representations which are not empirical. For without it, we should never have a priori the representations either of space or of time. They can be produced only through the synthesis of the manifold which sensibility presents in its original receptivity. We have thus a pure synthesis of apprehension. What does this mean? I cannot see your face, but the face that you may be putting out is the face I also had when I read this passage. So it's not that complicated. So he's saying that apprehension is the mind's operation of running through and unifying the manifold given in intuition. So ordering that raw data, that's raw sensory material in time, so it can be a single intuition. Cup, brown, soft texture, some kind of like cylindrical shape. Okay, all of those ideas, synthesis of apprehension, one unity, which is the cup. Okay, that's the first and basic synthetic act. It's just putting all those pieces of data together. Intuition gives me a manifold, but by itself, sensibility cannot give me a manifold. I would just see different properties. I get given things in succession, but sensibility cannot give me a grasp of succession in time. I need to take them together into a unity, and we need that a priori ability to affect that synthesis of apprehension. So that is a synthesis of apprehension, putting everything together in time. Then the second synthesis is the synthesis of reproduction, which is synthesis in imagination. Kant explains what that is very, very close by the first synthesis, that is A101, and he gives an example with a cinnabar. So he says, if cinnabar were sometimes red, sometimes black, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, if a man changed sometimes into this and sometimes into that animal form, if the country on the longest day were sometimes covered with fruit, sometimes with ice and snow, my empirical imagination would never find opportunity when representing red colour to bring to mind heavy cinnabar. Nor could there be an empirical synthesis of reproduction if a certain name were sometimes given to this, sometimes to that object, or where one and the same thing named sometimes in one way, sometimes in another, independently of any rule to which appearances are in themselves subject. So what is the synthesis of reproduction, or the synthesis that is done through the imagination? So this synthesis of reproduction is the imagination's power to bring past representations back to the mind when it happens again. So successive moments are connected, so I can remember earlier parts as I move on. He also gives the example of me drawing a line at A101. He says, when I seek to draw a line in thought, or to think of the time from one noon to another, or even to represent to myself some particular number, obviously the various manifold representations that are involved must be apprehended by me in thought one after the other. But if I were always to drop out of thought the preceding presentation, the first part of the line, the antecedent parts of the time period, or the units in the order represented, if I forgot that I was drawing a line and did not reproduce them while advancing to those that follow, a complete representation would never be obtained because I would have forgotten. So I need that continuity happening through time, and that is the synthesis done by the imagination, the synthesis of reproduction. It lets us represent a temporal sequence as continuous and allows the mind to reproduce past elements while attending to new ones. So I can continue my line. This makes continuity and expectation possible. I expect that, please, in a couple of months it will get warmer, maybe 6 or 7 months. Spring will have come. I'm expecting that it's going to be like last year. Through this synthesis of reproduction and the synthesis done by the imagination, there must be some rules that are posited so things do not change. So there needs to be some kind of regularity of appearances that helps our ability to associate things. And this is what Kant calls the reproductive imagination. So it's creating an association the same way in psychology Pavlov subjected a dog to a continuous association that related the sound of a bell with food. The same thing happens in our brains when we see a particular moment happening, or when we see that spring is coming, we get that expectation that it's going to get hotter. It's the same psychological process. So the reproductive imagination reproduces something that I have found already and learned it in the empirical world. And this is not a priori, we get it a posteriori. But then Kant also distinguishes between the reproductive imagination, which is what we expect, what we're going to predict in the future, what we have learned from the empirical world. But we also have the productive imagination, another part of the imagination that is different of use. It's a different use. The productive imagination allows us to formulate things or to fabricate things, to posit a property and another together. So I create a new thing as belonging together in intuition. Okay, that's the productive imagination. Then we have this third type of synthesis, which is a synthesis of recognition in a concept. And that is what happens when we recognize a concept. So at A103, Kant says, if we were not conscious that we think is the same as what we thought a moment before, all reproduction in the series of representations will be useless. So what is missing from the other two types of synthesis is that we need a rule or a necessity. What we grasp is more subjective play of perceptions. Nothing to compare or connect things are essentially loose and separate. We need that rule that is going to keep in time. That reproduction is going to keep the way it was before through time. So then I can recognize it again. Recognition is the act of me identifying reproduced representation as the same object. So moments ago I saw a cup, and now I say again, this is the same cup as what I saw 1 moment ago, right? So that is done by that unity of recognition. I am able to recognize things again. So this is where concepts secure the unity of the manifold as an object. So these are the three syntheses. Synthesis of apprehension, so getting all the bits that make up a object and put them into a unity. Synthesis of reproduction. So while I am doing it, I keep doing it. I know what I'm doing. That continuity is always there. And the synthesis of recognition. So when I see it again, I'll be able to tell that was that same thing. Then on the next couple of pages, Kant goes on and talks about the imagination and what is the imagination and what is the transcendental faculty of the imagination. In very brief words, the imagination is the productive power that carries out those syntheses, and the faculty of imagination is closely related and is part of the faculty of the understanding. Feels like sometimes Kant treats them differently, treats the imagination as something separate from the understanding, especially in the A deduction, but he later says that the imagination is part of the understanding. So he just starts straight off the bat and says that the transcendental faculty of the imagination is to reproduce and posit elements of all experience. He says, we must assume a pure transcendental synthesis of imagination as conditioning the very possibility of all experience. So the imagination is not merely a mere thing that we see or mere fancy. It's transcendental. It's a transcendental, so a priori and structuring faculty that actively, not passively, actively synthesizes the manifold of intuition that we get from intuition. It is the bridge, is what mediates raw sensibility, what we get from intuition, and the understanding by producing the representations in our understanding, and then thinks it through concepts, which are the categories. So then we have this imagination as the bridge between sensibility and understanding. But then we're missing something. What are we missing? That, all right, cool, so I get all these intuitions, the raw sensory data, and through the imagination I synthesize it also with the help of the understanding. So I completely perceive it, right? I comprehend it. It has meaning to me. But who does it? Myself? Who is myself? So I need to add that consciousness. I need to add that person that thinks it through. And this is what we call the unity of apperception. Okay. And again, there's going to be a transcendental apperception that Kant is going to introduce here. So the unity of apperception is the a priori single self-consciousness that unifies representations and grounds objective knowledge through one singular consciousness. In Kant's words, but it is clear that since we have to deal only with the manifold of our representations, and since that X, the objects which correspond to them, is nothing to us, being as it is something that has to be distinct from all our representations, the unity which the object makes necessary can be nothing else than the formal unity of consciousness in the synthesis of the manifold of representations. It is only when we have thus produced synthetic unity of the manifold of intuition that we are in a position to say that we know the object. But this unity is impossible if the intuition cannot be generated in accordance with a rule by means of such a function of synthesis as makes the reproduction of the manifold a priori necessary and renders possible a concept in which it is united. Thus we think a triangle as an object in that we are conscious of the combination of three straight lines according to a rule by which such an intuition can always be represented. This unity of rule determines on the manifold. So then that unity of apperception, that I as a pronoun that accompanies all my representations that I think must be able to accompany them, is very unclear in the A deduction. He's not saying I, he's just saying the unity of the apperception, and he sometimes says self-consciousness. He does not really say I, consciousness, awareness. He makes it much more clearer in the B deduction, okay? But I'm using B deduction terminology on the A deduction in order for us to comprehend it better. Otherwise, it's very obscure. So this unity of apperception is the formal requirement that makes a manifold of a representation a single unified field of knowledge that we can comprehend. So without it, representations would be empty, disconnected. No object of science would be possible because we don't have that unity of apperception that I think that permits it, unless our mind can recognize itself in every instance when we think about something, then it cannot recognize anything as a unity. This very unity, self-consciousness in Kant's words, of my mind requires of the unity to act in a synthesis. So the rules are not going to change because it comes from our mind. And this is what Kant says at A107. He says, this original transcendental condition is no other than transcendental apperception. Consciousness of self according to the determinations of our state in inner perception is merely empirical and always changing. No fixed and abiding self can present itself in this flux or in appearances. Such consciousness is usually named in a sense or empirical apperception. What has necessarily to be represented as numerically identical cannot be thought as such through empirical data. To render such a transcendental presupposition valid, there must be a condition which precedes all experience and which makes experience itself possible. Transcendental apperception then is the a priori stable self-consciousness that provides the numerical identity of the subject across changing states. And because this self-identity is presupposed, I think the mind can apply universal rules, the categories, and synthesize representations according to law. Principle that consciousness must be unified, while the unity of apperception is the faculty of, or the act of consciousness that achieves this unified self-awareness and acts as a necessary condition for all experience. A little bit later on, Kant clarifies finally what he means by objective validity and what is it, because at the moment we were just working with assumptions and hypothetical theories of what he meant. Here he explains it a little bit clearer, and he says that objective validity of a concept means it legitimately refers to objects of possible experience, and this is what the transcendental deduction must justify. He says, the objective validity of the categories as a priori concept rests, therefore, on the fact that, so far as the form of thought is concerned, Through them alone does experience become possible. They relate of necessity and a priori to objects of experience for the reason that only by means of them can any object whatsoever of experience be thought. So objective validity is a concept is legitimately applied to object of experience, and Kant's move here is to say, right, so if a concept is a necessary condition for any possible experience, then it legitimately applies to every object we can experience. So objective here is applicable to objects of possible experience, not out there in things in themselves, only for us, only for human appearances. Okay, so the theory is proved. We were right. So then what happens to unknown objects, things that we can't see, that are not given in experience? Well, so Kant talks about two different things here. So there's some objects like God, spirits, some metaphysical entities that can be thought through the categories, but they are not objects of experience, obviously. So thinking does not guarantee empirical presence. It's not that because it has empirical presence, I can think it through. There's also things that have not an empirical presence, but I can think them through. And this is one of the limits of our reason. Appearances are what we immediately know. The object corresponding to those representations as a transcendental object is something thought as the bearer of appearances, but not directly given. So Kant is distinguishing the appearance, what is given, from the idea of an object beyond our representations. So some concepts can think objects that are never given an experience, like God. They are unintelligible, not empirically instantiated. We cannot see it empirically, obviously. And then what happens to unknown objects, all the things that are not necessarily God, but they're not given in experience, things that are impossible, for example. So what Kant says in this situation is that I can think objects which may be impossible or cannot be given in any experience. How? So pure concepts allows us to think possible or impossible objects. I can think of a unicorn, but thinking them doesn't make them empirically real. Kant warns us that concepts can be extended beyond experience, like God, experience, unicorns, but the transcendental deduction secures categories validity only for objects of possible experience. There's other things that we can't know, we can't prove. So this is the end of section 2 of the A deduction. Now we're going to move on to section 3 of the A deduction. Kant promises that he's going to be more clear and more systematic. Let's see if that actually happens. And he's going to gather up everything that he's said so far. So up to this point, we have the three syntheses: apprehension, reproduction, and recognition. Now he wants to show how these three syntheses come together systematically and at the same time, and what they mean for how the understanding, our thinking faculty, can know objects a priori, that is, before experience. And for that, he starts talking about the three subjective sources of knowledge that makes experience possible, which is sense, that is the synthesis of apprehension, then imagination, the synthesis of reproduction, and apperception, which is a synthesis of recognition. So these three senses have an application to empirical objects, but also are a priori because it comes from our experience. Sense represents appearances empirically in perception, imagination represents appearances in association, and apperception represents appearances in the empirical consciousness of the identity of the reproduced representation. In recognition, thanks to the fact that you are your own self. So when you experience anything at all, your mind must be at the same time already doing these three things. First, you get the raw data, so you receive data through sense, then you organize it through time and connection, the imagination, and then you recognize it as your own experience and you unify it by the self-consciousness, and that is the apperception. All this happen together and at the same time, and without any of them there will be no coherent experience. We need them all three. All of this is done through the understanding. The sensibility is not going to do this, isn't it? So the understanding does not think about objects, but it's actually what makes objectivity possible through this synthesis. Because in every act of experiencing, your mind already applies those rules, the categories, to unify sensations and the concepts. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to experience anything at all. So when he says empirical consciousness is grounded in pure apperception, he means that your ability to have experiences that belong to oneself presupposes the a priori unity that the understanding gives. That's why the categories, the understanding's pure rules, apply to every possible object of experience. So in short, the unity of the selves, it will hold my experience together, and this is very related to the understanding because it's done through the understanding. At A116, Kant says, intuitions are nothing to us and do not in the least concern us if they cannot be taken up into consciousness, in which they may participate either directly or indirectly. You might perceive things, but unless they become conscious representations, they're nothing to you. They don't form part of your experience. That intuition needs to be taken up by the consciousness, otherwise it's just meaningless. So experience will be equal to perception plus the consciousness of that perception, that pure apperception. So only in this way knowledge is possible. We close a bridge. And this unity of consciousness that I think that must be able to accompany all of my representations is transcendental because it's a condition for experience. And this is what creates a transcendental principle of the unity of our perception, which is basically that, and the fact that it's synthetic is because it's not a logical identity. We get new knowledge from it. It unifies a manifold of raw data, many thoughts into one conscious experience, and that is why it's synthetic. The unity of consciousness is the foundation for all experience. There you have it. And because this unity is synthetic, it unifies a manifold, it's also the source of the categories, which are just the basic rules of this unification. So just as space and time are a priori forms of sensibility, the unity of our perception is the a priori form of the understanding. It's like the basis, the inner source of everything. And again, I want to make it very clear that for Kant there's two levels of self-consciousness. We have the empirical apperception, which is the one that we are aware of all the time. For example, I could say, I am aware that I am cold right now, and you can probably tell by my hot water bottle. That is something that is part of the actual awareness of myself right now, as I perceive, as I think, as I feel. It's a psychological self-consciousness. That's the empirical apperception. But I can also have a transcendental apperception, which is the structural condition that allows me to have any empirical perception, so that I think that can accompany all my experiences. Even if I'm not paying attention to it, I'm always part of this I think, otherwise I'll be dead. And this transcendental perception works with the imagination, but not with the reproductive imagination, because remember, reproductive imagination just reproduces images based on past experiences, like me remembering a melody, me recalling my mum's face. That's not what the transcendental apperception is about. The transcendental apperception works with the productive imagination, which is creating that unity in perception a priori, combining the manifold in a general way before any experience. So that is what makes possible to see anything and make it continuous. The productive imagination is the a priori activity that makes possible any unity of experience. Before you even recognize an object, your imagination is already structuring your sensory data into a possible experience. It's not that it just deforms it or changes it, it's already there. The moment zero, second zero. So space and time, force of intuition, categories, the forms of thought, and the imagination is the bridge between them. But we get to this point in the deduction and we realize Kant actually hasn't defined what the understanding is yet. So we know he's given many definitions, definitely, but we don't really know what the understanding itself is. We have an intuitive notion of it, but what is it? I think Kant here is ready to give us a definition of the understanding and how its pure concepts, the categories, arise from these acts of synthesis. At A119, he says, the unity of our perception in relation to the synthesis of imagination is the understanding, and this same unity, with reference to the transcendental synthesis of the imagination, the pure understanding. Whoa, alright. So, the unity of our perception, my self-consciousness, the I think, that falls under, or everything that falls under the I think, that unity of our perception, in relation to the synthesis of the imagination, productive imagination, putting all the manifold together into one singular thing, is the understanding. So, my self-consciousness plus combining the manifold, that's the understanding. Do you see the relation now between the sensibility and the understanding? In order for me to apprehend anything, I need the understanding through the imagination. Do you see how Kant is putting all the puzzles together? That's quite smart. And if it happens a priori, then it's pure understanding. He's building all of those bridges between apperception, imagination, and understanding. And given that synthesis is an empirical, not based on sense experiences, but transcendental, then we're talking about the pure understanding. And that will be the case of the categories. So the pure understanding doesn't deal with particular objects, but with the necessary forms of combining any possible manifold, the categories. In the understanding, there are then pure a priori modes of knowledge which contain the necessary unity of the pure synthesis of imagination in respect of all possible appearances. Which means Inside the understanding, there are built-in a priori ways of combining things, the rules of synthesis, that makes possible any experiences and appearances at all. And those built-in software rules in our brain are the categories. And we know this quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So each category is a way the mind must combine the manifold to make sense of it as an object of experience. All appearances, Kant says, a state of a possible experience, are subject to this understanding. All that you perceive, every appearance is already bound up with the understanding's forms. And this relation of appearances to possible experience is indeed necessary, for otherwise they would yield no knowledge and would not in any way concern us. So if appearances were not connected to the categories, if there were just raw sensations without form, we would not have knowledge of them. It'd just be floating around, it would just be chaos. And the synthesis in imagination is objectively necessary. As Kant says a little bit later, without synthetic unity in their connection, it would be impossible. Such synthetic unity is itself, therefore, objectively necessary. Even what we call empirical experience is subjected by these a priori structures. So we can only have experience because our mind supplies the unifying form. Therefore, and this is the conclusion Kant is trying to get to, nature's order, nature, comes from us. He says, thus the order and regularity in the appearances, which we entitle nature, we ourselves introduce. We don't derive the order of nature from the world, the external world, we bring that order to the world through our mental faculties. So nature would be the appearances structured according to the categories, which is crazy. And again, this doesn't mean that we physically create nature, it's more like we create the structure through which we perceive nature. Okay, so let's just condense all of this that we've learned. So experience requires unity. Cool. Otherwise we'll have random sensations, not coherent objects. Then unity requires synthesis. Otherwise, how am I going to have a unity? So the manifold must be combined into one consciousness. Synthesis requires rules. Otherwise, there will be no consistent combination that could occur. Then those rules are the categories of the understanding, a priori structures, and that make every single possibility of experience possible. And then the imagination mediates between intuition and the understanding, so it organizes intuitions and puts that bridge so the categories can apply. And then finally, experience and nature are possible only because our minds contribute to these a priori structures. A125. Thus the order and regularity in the appearances which we entitle nature, we ourselves introduce. We could never find them in appearances had not we ourselves, or the nature of our mind, originally set them there. Crazy quote. So then what would be the final consequence of the A deduction? It would be that if experience itself is only possible through this synthesis, governed by the understanding and the imagination, then the understanding is what makes nature possible as an order system, which is why I said again we make nature. So the understanding is the lawgiver of nature as we see it, as appearances. And this is what Kant says in this quote. Thus the understanding is something more than a power of formulating rules through a comparison of appearances. It is itself the lawgiver of nature. So then he concludes the A section and he says, pure understanding is thus in the categories the law of the synthetic unity of all appearances, and thereby first originally makes experience as regards its form possible. So the summary of the whole deduction, A edition, would be categories are a priori because they are what they make the unity of experience possible. Therefore, the application to appearances is justified, not by observation, but by their transcendental necessity, and the understanding is itself the lawgiver of nature. Right, okay, before I move on to the B deduction, I want to talk about, as a side note, what is for Kant a transcendental object and what is a transcendental subject. So that relationship between the object and the subject. So the transcendental subject for Kant would be the subject that makes experience possible by unifying all the manifold, all the elements of experience in a single consciousness. So objects can only be given if they're given to a single subject. So something needs to contain everything, a single consciousness, right? Otherwise, who is going to contain everything that exists? The transcendental subject must be aware of this unity, and that's the self-consciousness. Self-consciousness of this subject is the transcendental unity of our perception. Now, the transcendental object, which is the idea of an object, explains the transcendental unity of our perception, the subject, and vice versa. It is reciprocal. So the transcendental object would not exist without the transcendental subject. And why is this reciprocal? Because the ability to refer to all experience as an underlying rule, the unity of objects, to a transcendental object requires a transcendental act of synthesis affected by the transcendental subject through the a priori use of the understanding. If we have a unified world of objects, things are not illusions, they actually exist, they fit into unity. It's not like Berkeley's idealism where, nothing really, there's no object to refer to the idea. Then this unified world of objects is unified in a single conscious, transcendental unity of our perception through the a priori positing of a framework of rules. So for that we need the understanding. So in order to experience objects, a transcendental unity of our perception has to perform, using the categories, a transcendental act of synthesis. There's a unified ground to unified rules to create a unity. So that's why the reciprocity, right? The unified world of objects, unified transcendental subject. The transcendental subject must be self-conscious, but it can be aware of itself only through an awareness of its own transcendental role, because it is exhausted by its own transcendental role. And what is a transcendental role? It is to carry out transcendental synthesis that makes possible this unity of objects. And then if there's no unified world of objects, there would not be a transcendental subject, and vice versa. The subject and the object could not be taken apart. This is quite obscure, but I will come back to it in the future. But again, it's a transcendental object, transcendental subject together. Welcome to the B deduction. Okay, so this should be a little bit clearer. It's still obscure. We're doing Kant. It's not going to be a walk in a park. It's not going to be a Dickens novel, but it should be more revealing now. So, right, paragraph 15. We start the B deduction, and paragraph 15 is about combination. So combination is about synthesis of a unity of the manifold. Getting the raw data, combination, okay? The manifold is obviously intuition, and the form of intuition lies a priori in our faculty of representation. At B1, is it B1? Yeah. B129, B130, he says, but the combination, which he calls conjuncture, of a manifold in general can never come to us through the senses, and cannot therefore be already contained in the pure form of sensible intuition. So the combination happens inside of us. The act of combination, we already know, is called synthesis. The fact that we say they belong together is a judgment. It is not insensibility itself. And Kant makes an addition as well in B130. He says, but the concept of combination includes, besides the concept of the manifold and of its synthesis, also the concepts of the unity of manifold. Combination is representation of the synthetic unity of the manifold. So this unity itself is not a category. We are working at a pre-categorical level. So when we apply a category at all, there is already a certain unity, so they can be applied correctly, which is a unity of synthesis. A bit obscure here, but that's what he says. So what is this unity then? Well, it even comes before the categories, so how is that going to be a unity before the categories? I don't know. That's what Kant says. B130, you want to have a look at it and explain it to me? You're more than welcome. Right, paragraph 16. In paragraph 16, he talks about the unity of our perception. We already know that from the A section, so we just brush through it a little bit. So at B132, Kant says, it must be possible for the I think, finally he says I think, to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me which could not be thought at all, and that is equivalent to saying that the representation would be impossible, or at least would be nothing to me. That representation which can be given prior to all thought is entitled intuition. Kant starts the deduction from this point, right? So any experience we have, any sound, any smell, any color, any memory, must be something you can be conscious of as yours. So if you couldn't say I think this, then the experience wouldn't really make sense. It wouldn't really belong to you at all. It would just happen in you, like random sensations and thoughts that brush through your mind without any meaning. So any elements that I am not able to become aware of as being something that I think, then it is not an element of my experience at all. The I think is a mark of self-consciousness, and it must be possible to attach it to any representation you have. This possibility is what gives unity to our experience. B132 as well, he says, I call it pure apperception to distinguish it from empirical apperception. We already know about distinction. Or again, original apperception, because it is that self-consciousness which, while generating a representation, I think, a representation which must be capable of accompanying all other representations, and which in all consciousness is one and the same, cannot itself be accompanied by any further representation. And again, apperception means self-awareness, So the mind's awareness of its own representations. Remember that the empirical apperception is things that happens to you, like I feel cold, I feel hot, I feel cozy. And the pure apperception was that transcendental apperception, which is the fact that everything comes under, is included in that I think. And why does Kant calls it original? He calls it original because it's a source of unity. It's not derived from experience, but a condition for experience. You don't find perceptions, and then from those perceptions you find the self. You have a universal self through which perceptions are organized. And then B132 as well, he introduces a transcendental unity of self-apperception. He says the unity of this apperception I likewise entitle the transcendental unity of self-consciousness in order to indicate the possibility of a priori knowledge arising from it. We already know about this, okay? It's just the a priori condition of the possibility of experience at all through this unity of the self. And everyone has this transcendental unity of self-perception. It's a universal thing. And he explains this at B133, where he says, as my representations, even if I am not conscious of them as such, they must conform to the condition under which alone they can stand together in one universal self-consciousness, because otherwise it would not all, without exception, belong to me. From this arena combination, many consequences follow, and we'll see what those consequences are, Kant. And then at the end of paragraph 16, he calls this unity of self-apperception, the highest principle of knowledge. So it's the basis of everything. He says, the principle of apperception is the highest principle in the whole sphere of human knowledge. Everything we can know presupposes this unity of the I think. Without the I think, there would be no stable subject, there would be no transcendental object. Then this relation of the transcendental object and the transcendental subject come together here in this moment. And because this unity is a priori, it comes before experience, it grounds the possibility of a priori knowledge. So the kind of necessary universal truths Kant is trying to explain. He continues this argument of this being the highest principle of all knowledge in paragraph 17. So again, up until this point, we get that we receive a manifold of intuition, the raw sense of data, structured by space and time through the transcendental aesthetic. Then to know anything at all, those intuitions might be combined into one consciousness. That's the job of the understanding, the unity of apperception, and that's what we call the synthetic unity of apperception, puts everything together. So now in this section, Kant states the supreme principle of all use of the understanding. He says at B13C, the supreme principle of the possibility of all intuition in its relation to sensibility is, according to the transcendental aesthetic, that all the manifold of intuition should be subject to the formal conditions of space and time. That's what I just said. The supreme principle of the same possibility in its relation to understanding is that all the manifold of intuition should be subject to conditions of the original synthetic unity of our perception. And as we will see, this doesn't mean that it's happening one after the other. It happens at the same time, but different transcendental points of view. The transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental logic work together at the same time. But it's just two chapters in the Critique of Pure Reason because they are separate things, even though they happen all together. And then in B137, Kant finally admits this relationship between the unity of consciousness and objects makes everything have objective validity. At B137, he says, it is the unity of consciousness that alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object, and therefore the objective validity. So the fact that you can unite perceptions is not just merely psychological. It is the very condition, the very a priori condition that allows something to count as an object at all, for you, for us, for everyone. Then moving on to paragraph 18. Paragraph 18 is a very quick comment on the objective unity of self-consciousness, so it should be quite fast. The main idea is that we don't get objects just because experiences happen to run together in our heads. That would be merely subjective. We get objects only because our mind imposes a necessary rule-governed unity, the transcendental unity of our perception, the I think, from the manifold of intuition. And this is what makes it objective. Okay, he's not saying that everything is objective and it must be the same thing for everyone in terms of maybe for someone this is not a brown cup, it's something else. Or maybe justice means something for one person, means something else for another person. That's not what Kant is saying. Kant is talking about something much more general. Something like, it's just there's an objective unity through which representations are combined. The way we do it, okay, that gives experience objective validity. And at B140, he says, to one man, for instance, a certain word suggests one thing, to one, some other thing. That's not what he means by subjective, right? That is subjective in the sense that one person thinks one thing about an object and another person thinks another. But that is just subjective association. It's not genuine cognition. It's not what Kant is talking about. So after this quick comment, we move on to paragraph 19. In paragraph 19's title is The logical form of all judgments consists in the objective unity of the apperception of the concepts which they contain. Right, so it means, so in this paragraph, Kant is linking judgments directly to the objective unity of apperception, so how we put them together. Logical forms of judgments is the structure or way a judgment is put together, is the grammar of our thinking, and that is how we put things together in an objective unity of the apperception and are able to comprehend things. Judgments for Kant are extremely important because all of the judgments have certain structure, and the structure is the way its concepts are unified in one self-consciousness. This unity that we get is what makes judgments about an object objective and not merely subjective associations. And at this point, Kant criticizes logicians and what logicians think about judgments. This is B141. He says, for a logician, a judgment is a representation of a relation between two concepts without anything else. But Kant says, B141, I find that a judgment is nothing but the manner in which given modes of knowledge are brought to the objective unity of our perception. This is what is intended by the copula is. So a judgment expresses how representations, concepts, perceptions are unified under the I thing, which makes them objectively valid. The copula is makes or signals this objective unity, which distinguishes from mere subjective associations like a personal habit or thought of memory or different interpretations of a word. And this is what Kant says at B142. Only in this way does there arise from this relation a judgment which is objectively valid and so can be adequately distinguished from a relation that would have only subjective validity. So judgments require that transcendental unity. Otherwise, we only have personal associations and not knowledge. And he's, thank God, going to give us an example of what constitutes for him objective observation and a subjective observation, or objective knowledge and subjective observations. He gives the example of at B142, you feel in the weight of a body. So if you say, if I support a body, I feel the impression of weight. Feel a body, the cup, on my lap. I feel the impression of the weight of the cup. That would be subjective, a subjective observation. So in this instant, I put the cup on my lap and I feel the weight of it, or I feel the weight of the book on my lap. That would be a merely subjective observation. But if I say the book is heavy or the cup is heavy, I am making a much interesting claim, because I'm making a necessary claim that the book is heavy. So that is a very interesting distinction, right? If I support a body and feel the impression of its weight, it's not a unity, it's subjective, because I just notice these two things one after the other. But if I say that body is heavy, that implies a necessity. I am thinking that the body itself is heavy, contains the property of weight. They belong together. The word is claims that they go together, and object and heaviness is something rounded in this object. It gives it objective validity, objective unity, instead of just saying, oh, this thing happened and then this other thing happened. So judgments are not only relations of concepts, they express the objective unity of representation in one's self-consciousness, and that's that copula is. That will be a judgment of affirmation, right? So that's the marker of objective unification and not just repeated experience. That's a very good distinction that Kant had to make, and I'm really proud of him. Well done, Kant. That's very interesting. Right, okay, paragraph 20. In paragraph 20, very short, it's just a summary, basically. The paragraph is called all sensible intuitions are subject to the categories, we already know that, as conditions under which alone their manifold can come together in one consciousness. Literally a recap. Just brings in the categories and the kind of use of judgment in which they unify the manifold given in intuition, and that is precisely what the categories are, the functions of judgment in which they happen. Categories are derived from judgments, that's what we did in the previous video. So all sensible intuitions stand under the categories. And after paragraph 20, we feel that Kant has said everything that he had to say. Yeah, experience is equal to unified perception, the combination is the act of the understanding, unity is the unity of our perception, the judgment is the explicit act of that unity, and therefore we need the categories. But then he continues, paragraphs 21 up until 28. What is Kant trying to do here? Isn't it done? Well, there's many interpretations of why Kant continued to Transcendental Deduction and wrote more paragraphs after this section. I'm not going to get into the different interpretations. I'm just going to say that maybe Kant wanted to point out, and this is Conant Kant's version, Kant's interpretation, that he just wanted to point out that the transcendental aesthetic is deeply connected with the transcendental logic and they happen at the same time, and there's no need to say that when I experience things in a space and time, I experience it in a different way without the categories, and then when I apply the categories, that's when I get knowledge. So there's a pre-categorical moment of my experience where I don't apply the categories, and then that reality gets transformed by the categories, distorted by the categories, or contaminated. No, I think Kant is trying to say, well, these things happen together at the same time. From the second zero, you see things through the categories. If you want to know more about this and what could be the potential reason why Kant did this, I really recommend Victor Gisver's, I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, Victor Gisver's video, James Conant on the Deduction. I don't remember what video it is, I think it's video 32. One of the videos is titled James Conant on Deduction, and he explains it very, very well, and I'm not going to get into that much detail on it. I really recommend his channel, by the way. It's one of the reasons why I studied philosophy in the first place. Right, okay, so a summary of what Conant says is that we have a very tempting misconception that we can have until this point, that the transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental logic are separate. And first we have the aesthetic and then we have the logic. And he calls this the layer cake conception, because one layer comes after the other. Conant says this is wrong, and this is why Kant wrote several sections of this transcendental deduction, to make sure that we don't have this misconception. A conception of objectivity involves all the subjective conditions of knowledge. So the very first moment we perceive something in sensibility, that is already subject to the subjective conditions of knowledge, and there are no stages, no layers of a cake. And the reason why in the aesthetic we are not getting introduced to the understanding, we are not getting introduced to all of the synthesis, imagination, all of these things that we've talked about in the transcendental deduction. The reason why Kant is not doing it in the transcendental aesthetic is because it's a preliminary to the logic. If he bombards it with all of that information, we're going to go crazy. So he did it in stages in order to explain it, but that doesn't mean that they go in stages in real life. So everything is one layer made out of the same batter, okay? It's not different layers. Okay, so after we've established the reason why Kant kept writing, we're going to go to paragraph 21. These are some observations that Kant made. At B144, he says, the categories have their source in the understanding alone, independently on sensibility. That is interesting, right? So even if sensibility does not exist at all, we still have the categories that reside in the understanding. And this is precisely the reason why we haven't touched the sensibility in a transcendental deduction, because the categories are pure a priori. They don't need sensibility. They can be applied to sensibility, but they come before experience. And then he established his intention at B145. He says, in what follows, confer section 26, it will be shown from the mode in which the empirical intuition is given in sensibility that its unity is no longer than that which the category, according to section 20, prescribes to the manifold of any given intuition. Only thus, by demonstration of the a priori validity of the categories in respect of all objects of our senses, will the purpose of the deduction be fully attained. He will say that the way we perceive sensibility cannot be in a way, but in a way in which the categories are prescribed. There's no other way. Only after he has made this clear, he will conclude the deduction is done. In paragraph 22, he just puts emphasis on the fact that the categories can only be applied to experience. So the categories therefore do not give themselves knowledge of things, but they need to be applied to empirical intuitions in order to get knowledge. That's why knowledge requires intuitions and concepts. So they only serve us for the possibility of empirical knowledge, which is what we call experience. And the conclusion to paragraph 22 is at B148, and he says, in other words, they serve only for the possibility of empirical knowledge, and such knowledge is what we entitle experience. Our conclusion is therefore this: the categories, as yielding knowledge of things, have no kind of application, save only in regard to things which may be objects of possible experience. So even though the categories exist independently of sensibility, they need to be applied to empirical things, otherwise we will have no knowledge. Paragraph 23 is basically a continuation of paragraph 22. Kant establishes the limitations of the applications of the pure concepts of the understanding of the categories. So the same way pure intuitions like space and time are valid no further than from objects of the senses, and therefore only for experience, beyond these limits they represent nothing, for they are only in the senses, and beyond them have no reality. That's B148. Without space and time, without objects, without experience, space and time would not make sense. But the categories itself are a little bit more free freer than space and time, because they can indeed be extended beyond experience. It's not that we need experience 100%. We can extend the categories beyond experience, but as I said, they would just be meaningless, like they will have no point. And this is what Kant says at B149. The pure concepts of understanding are free from this limitation and extend to objects of intuitions in general, be the intuition like or unlike ours, if only it be sensible and not intellectual. But this extension of concepts beyond our sensible intuition is of no advantage to us, for as concepts of objects they are then empty, and do not even enable us to judge of the objects whether or not they are possible. They are mere forms of thought without objective reality, since we have no intuition at hand to which the synthetic unity of our perception, which constitutes the whole content of these forms, could be applied, and in being so applied determine an object. Only our sensible and empirical intuition can give them body and meaning. So without intuition, the categories are just empty. Right, paragraph 44 is intense. So there's a lot going on in paragraph 44, in paragraph 24. And it's divided into two parts. So the first part is about how we can consider the categories in the application to sensibility. So how the pure concepts of understanding relate to a sensible given intuition. And again, this was covered in the A deduction, and we already know the answer. So the reason why the pure concepts can relate to sensible intuition is through the imagination, because the imagination is the part of the understanding that deals with objects that are sensible in nature. Kant introduces in the B deduction something that was not in the A deduction, and that is that the faculty of imagination has two levels of synthesis, and that is intellectual synthesis and figurative or transcendental synthesis. Intellectual synthesis, in Latin synthesis intellectualis, is the abstract combination of the manifold in the category. And then the figurative or the transcendental synthesis of the imagination, which is a synthesis speciosa, is the a priori figurative synthesis that produces a sensible image, the intuition corresponding to the category, so that the category can apply to appearances. Intellectual synthesis, figurative synthesis. So the figurative or transcendental synthesis of the imagination is also called the transcendental synthesis of the imagination. So that is the point at which the understanding generates the unity of sensibility. And again, the imagination is this bridge between sensibility and understanding, because imagination belongs to sensibility when it thinks, in order to work through the imagination. Otherwise, what are we going to imagine? What are we going to synthesize? But still works through spontaneity, which is what the understanding does. We need that active part of the imagination that synthesizes things, so that's part of the understanding. Again, that is why it's linked between the two. So Kant is again arguing that an object of sensibility, in order to be intelligible, must have a unity, and that requires imagination, and the imagination requires the understanding, and that requires categories. And I guess the second part of paragraph 24, Kant goes back to the transcendental aesthetic, and he says, yes, so at paragraph 6 and the transcendental aesthetic, I said we could not be able to perceive ourselves as we are, as things in themselves. We only get a knowledge about ourselves as inner appearances, but not as things in themselves. So you will never be able to know yourself in the nominal sense, only in the appearances sense. And this was related to the way we understand and we perceive things in outer space. We're not going to be able to understand the noumena. To see the noumena, we only see things as outer appearances. We still have objective validity, but as outer appearances. So the same thing that happens on the outside has to happen on the inside. What is different? Nothing. So that's what Kant's arguing here. At B154, he says, this we can always perceive in ourselves. We cannot think a line without drawing it in thought, or a circle without describing it. We cannot represent the three dimensions of space save by setting three lines at right angles to one another from the same point. Even time itself we cannot represent, even in so far as we attend in the drawing of a straight line, which has to serve as the outer figurative representation of time, merely to the act of the synthesis of the manifold whereby we successfully determine inner sense, and in so doing attend to the succession of this determination in inner sense. So as humans, we use our understanding to unify representations, but we cannot ourselves supply intuitions or supply representations. To make experience possible, the understanding performs a conscious act of synthesis by the productive imagination or the figurative imagination that Kant causes now. And that happens to the self as well. So I cannot represent the succession, yesterday I went to the park, today I stayed at home. And I cannot make that in succession unless the understanding via the categories and the productive imagination unifies those moments as mine. So that's those raw moments of innocence become a coherent temporal sequence only when the understanding synthesizes them. And that is why we cannot know ourselves as things in themselves. pre-understanding, pre-categorical structures. And this idea of succession of thought requires a manifold of outer sense. And the fact that it also applies both in the outside and in the inside is based on the fact that for Kant, space and time are intertwined together. I cannot think things in succession without some kind of spatial framework of it. One thing comes after the other. Our conception of time and space are very intertwined together because you would not be able to intuit succession without space. Space and time work together and in a sense would not be able to be posited by us without space. So that's why we cannot know ourselves. Only we can know ourselves in appearances. And this is what Kant concludes at B156 in this very chunky paragraph, but I'm just going to read the end of it. So he says, in other words, that so far as in intuition is concerned, we know our own subject only as appearance, not as it is in itself. Right, very quickly, paragraph 26 about existence and makes a very quick distinction about two different kinds of self-awareness. So we have the I think, the pure act of thought, the transcendental unity of self-perception, and then we have the self as if appears in inner sense. So the only way we can know ourselves, basically, which is the intuitions in time. So things that happen to me, things that I feel, which would be the empirical apperception. And then here, in this distinction, he's showing a limit. Even though the I think accompanies all my representation, so it's the form of all consciousness, it doesn't tell me what I am. It's just something that comes after the unity of self-perception. Doesn't tell me who I am as a person. To know what I am, I would need intuition. Some way to be given to myself, apply the categories and the understanding to it, so I get some intuitions. And at B157, he says, I am conscious of myself, not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am. So that would be that I think, that unity of our perception. Okay, paragraph 26 is when Kant tries to answer the question again about how we can know a priori that the categories actually apply to the objects with me in experience, to nature itself. So in this paragraph, he asks himself the question of how can we know that the categories apply to objects in nature? We don't want to show that the categories exist. We want to know why nature necessarily conforms to them. Why is that? And again here, he brings the synthesis of apprehension and he says at B160, it is the combination of the manifold in an empirical intuition whereby perception, that is the empirical consciousness of the intuition, is possible. So he's just repeating himself saying, yeah, the synthesis of apprehension is what makes empirical intuition possible. And B160 he also says that space and time are not only a priori forms of intuition, they are intuitions themselves, and they are entities themselves of some kind, and they're certainly present in every empirical intuition that we have. And at the same time, space and time presupposes a synthesis, which would be what Kant brings new to the table as something that completes a transcendental aesthetic. They also have synthesis, but he did not talk about that synthesis in the transcendental aesthetic because we were not ready. And just again repeats himself and he says, spatio-temporal forms require space and times require synthesis of our perception by the understanding. So he's doing the same that he did to the categories to space and time. So then this synthesis of our perception by the understanding requires the categories. And he closes the circle. He says, everything I've said requires that synthesis, space and time and the categories. Therefore, we need the categories to experience anything. And this is what he says at B161. This synthetic unity can be no other than the unity of the combination of the manifold of a given intuition in general in an original consciousness, in accordance with the categories, insofar as the combination is applied to a sensible intuition. Or synthesis, therefore, even that which renders perception possible, is subject to the categories. And since experience is knowledge by means of connected perceptions, the categories are conditions of the possibility of experience and are therefore valid a priori for all objects of experience. Nature, therefore, has to follow the structure of the categories because there's no way of escaping them. And Kant gives an example here about how we apply this to the categories. This is one of the few times he gives a good example that is easy to understand. B163. He says, when, to take another example, I perceive the freezing of water, I apprehend two states, fluidity and solidity, and these are standing to one another in a relation of time. Now, this synthetic unity is the category of cause, which means by means of which, when I apply it to my sensibility, I determine everything that happens in accordance with the relation which it prescribes. So this is a direct demonstration that the category of cause and effect structures our temporal perceptions from the very beginning, and is not learned from them, but conditions that happen in order for us to experience it. And that's how he concludes that without the categories, there's no experience at all, connected experience at all. And we finally get to the last paragraph, paragraph 27. This is just about the limits of the categories and how the limits of the categories are only in possible experience. Kant begins by summarizing the essential result of the deduction, what he's achieved at B166. He says, we cannot think an object save through categories. We cannot know an object, so thoughts save through intuitions corresponding to these concepts. Now, all our intuitions are sensible, and this knowledge, so far as this object is given, is empirical. But empirical knowledge is experience. Consequently, there can be no a priori knowledge except of objects of possible experience. This doesn't mean all knowledge comes from experience, and that's what the next sentence, B166, B167. But although this knowledge is limited to objects of experience, it is not therefore all derived from experience. The pure intuitions of receptivity and the pure concept of understanding are elements in knowledge, and both are found in us a priori. All knowledge applies to experience. Empirically, therefore, is empirically limited. But part of what makes this experience possible is not derived from experience. So reason is not empty, but it cannot overstep its bounds. Then at B167, he states the problem again, goes back to the principal problem of the critique, which is, how can we fit understanding and sensibility so perfectly together? How do they work so perfectly together? He says, there are only two ways in which we can account for a necessary agreement of experience with the concepts of its objects. Either experience makes this concept possible, or this concept makes experience possible. That's what he says at the very beginning of the critique. And then the first option, experience makes this concept possible, that would be empiricism. Whereas the concept making experience possible would be the Kantian view. So immediately Kant rejects the empiricist view at again B167. The former supposition, empiricism, does not hold in respect of the categories, nor of pure sensible intuition, for since they are a priori concepts and therefore independent of experience, the ascription to them of an empirical origin would be a sort of generation equivoca. So you cannot derive a priori concept from experience, which is a posteriori. It doesn't make sense. We've already talked about this. So then only the second option remains, right? So B167, there remains therefore only the second supposition, a system, as it were, of the epigenesis of pure reason, namely that the categories contain, on the side of the understanding, the grounds of the possibility of all experience in general. So only that can be possible. And then the final conclusion at B169, the deduction is the exposition of the pure concept of the understanding and therewith of full theoretical a priori knowledge as principles of the possibility of experience, the principles being here taken as a determination of appearances in space and time in general, and this determination in turn as ultimately following from the original synthetic unity of our perception, as the form of the understanding in its relation to space and time, the original forms of sensibility. He wrapped it up. Wow, this was very intense to film. My brain hurts, but we've done it. Okay, we finished the transcendental deduction, the big deduction. Now it's going to get easier, I guess. I mean, it's still going to be intense, but Kantian standards, not that hard. And then you'll probably be asking what comes after the transcendental deduction, because the end of the transcendental deduction, it ends here. What is all this? So we're going to have the analytical principles now, which is still part of the transcendental analytic. We're going to talk about schematism, which is how the categories are ensured reference to objects via the a priori intuition of time, and as a result they are not ensured reference to things in themselves. That's schematism. And then we're going to talk about how each category applies to appearances using the axioms of intuition, which deals with the categories of quantity, the anticipations of perception, which deals with the categories of quality, the analogies of experience, which is the categories of relation, and finally the postulates of empirical thought, which deals with the categories of modality. So then that's going to be the next video. I hope that I brought you some light to what the transcendental deduction is saying. I do believe that it's actually not that bad. After you've gone through the whole thing, you realize that his argument, for better or for worse, is quite simple after you understand all the concepts. So just let me know what you think, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed this video, and see you in the next one. Bye. I think I understand Kant now. Wow.